Hi there and welcome to The Perspective on Berita Satu. I'm Blaise Hope. With me in the studio is David Adelman, a former state senator in Georgia and former US ambassador to Singapore, who is now a partner at the global law firm Reed Smith, LLP. Thank you for joining us, David.
Terry McCossie. Thank you, Blaise. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's just start with the US in Asia over the past few years, a role in which you've played a part. How would you characterize it?
Well, I think the last 5 or 6 years, really going back to the beginning of the Obama presidency, have been a great time for American relations in the region. As you know, one of the principal pillars of President Obama's foreign policy was to pivot or rebalance America's interests to the region. I think we've had a lot of success. The relationships across the board have deepened, and now I think the challenge is to make America's pivot to Asia more durable or sustainable.
And do you think the pivot to Asia or a similar thing would have happened without the current president?
Well, it's hard to say. There was, of course, tremendous economic growth in this part of the world, and to be sure, the United States has been deeply engaged in Asia since the end of World War II. There's a statistic I like to think about when this question comes up, and it happened in March of 2010, so now several years ago, when for the first time U.S. exports to Asia exceeded U.S. exports to Europe. And I don't think that trend is likely to reverse, at least not in our lifetimes. So in some ways, America's pivot to Asia has followed the economic growth in this part of the region.
Or would you say that this was your mission, was to make sure that this happened when you came to Singapore?
Well, you know, being a diplomatic representative of the United States in an important part of the world, I think, is meaningful no matter where you are. It is true that this was an especially good time to be an American diplomat here in Asia. When we came into office in 2009, the President and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton outlined 3 principal foreign policy goals. First, to reframe the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Second, to reset American relations with Russia. And third, to pivot or rebalance America's interests in Asia. The first 2 have proven to be very difficult, but I'm very delighted to say, as someone who served on the front lines of America's pivot to Asia, I think we've had a good amount of success. So it was very high on our list, along with all of the diplomatic work we have done in this part of the world for more than 100 years.
In terms of defense, there was an increased collaboration with Singapore while you were there. Is that correct?
Well, that's true. That's true. 2011 and 2012 were very big years for the American security engagement in Asia. In 2011, then U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue announced that United States naval assets would be shifted so that for the first time, again, since the end of World War II, a majority of U.S. Navy assets would be in the Pacific as opposed to the Atlantic. A year later, former U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, again in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, announced that American Air Force assets would be shifted so that a majority would now be in the Pacific. To be sure, the United States has underwritten security in this part of the world since the end of World War II, but the security engagement has become even deeper. In Singapore, we were able to come to an agreement to forward deploy 4 littoral combat ships to Changi Naval Base in Singapore, which was a real breakthrough and took the U.S.-Singapore security relationship to an even higher level.
Is this going to be a case of the U.S. just continuing to underwrite more, or is there going to be more coming from states in Asia?
Well, the best part about the security pivot, I think, has been the dynamic Southeast Asian countries sort of meeting the United States and partnering in providing security, especially in the South China Sea. Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, without exception, the countries in this part of the world and Malaysia have all really raised their game so that what we're seeing now is a true partnership between the United States and especially the countries in ASEAN, ensuring freedom of navigation, security, and stability in the region.
Staying on the topic of defense for the moment, there's a presidential race coming up.
Yes.
Hillary Clinton, a Secretary of State that you served under, is running in it. Do you see her continuing the policy should she win?
Well, I think so. Her term as Secretary of State proved she has an understanding of the region and a deep commitment. She crisscrossed Asia for her entire 4 years as Secretary of State. I was lucky enough to move around the region a couple of times with her, and I think the U.S. pivot to Asia would be very well served by a President Clinton. A second President Clinton, I would add. But to be sure, you know, when you consider the top competitors, the candidates on the Republican side, without exception, I think we can count on, regardless of the outcome of the election, the next U.S. president continuing the commitment to the region. So I think the prospects for America's pivot or rebalancing to Asia being sustainable and durable are very good.
Just quickly on the U.S. election, do you think there's a serious challenger to Hillary Clinton yet?
Oh, sure. Listen, American elections have been very competitive now, going on 30 years, and I would expect the election in 2016 will be hard fought and very competitive.
Okay, great. Well, let's probably the biggest thing that dominates news here about the U.S. and about the economy is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Sure. This is the big deal. Can you speak a bit about what you think is the importance of that? Well,
it's a blockbuster, and in many ways it's the centerpiece of the American pivot to Asia. 12 countries, the 3 powerful countries in NAFTA, as well as in Asia, Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, Australia, New Zealand, Peru, Chile. This is a blockbuster deal representing 30% of global trade, 40% of global GDP. And I think it's a game changer in the sense that trade flows undoubtedly will increase across the Pacific in both directions. For the United States, it's easy to see why the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be so attractive. By most estimates, U.S. exports would increase by more than $120 billion in the 10 years after the deal went into effect. For the economies out here, again, it's clear why the deal would be so attractive. Access to the powerful American consumer market. And I think very importantly, leaders in this part of the region who are participating in the talks recognize that being a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership will allow them to attract even more American investment, create good jobs in their local economies, and the rising tide should lift all boats. So I'm very optimistic about the prospects of the TPP ultimately going into effect, and I'm certain when it does that it will benefit the friends and partners who have decided to be a part of the agreement.
Okay, we've got to go to break right now, but just before we go, you believe it will go into effect?
I'm very optimistic. Most of the signs coming out of Washington, and especially after the successful visit by Prime Minister Abe just last week to Washington, seem to indicate things are on track.
Okay, great. We'll be back on The Perspective in just a minute.
Thank you.